أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for any errors that I might make through the frailty of being human. So this is continuation of the chronology and epistemology of my engagement with our mother, Hajar. I kind of took you through the beginning, so I'll just do a quick reminder for those who maybe didn't listen to that one, but 1993, my first year back in the US, I'm teaching in a Muslim majority country in Malaysia at an international Islamic university, and being part of the formation of a pro-faith, pro-feminist Muslim women's organization, Sisters in Islam. I looked at the landscape of the conversation over the year of the family, according to the UN. And I also made transitions in my own experience of family and became, for the second time, a female head of household, Black hijabi in the United States. And there was a collective organized and funded for an interreligious conversation between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women. We went on a retreat, and they called it the Daughters of Sarah and Hagar. And that started another critical interrogation on my part, which included several presentations and panels at the American Academy of Religion on the need to critically engage the assumptions that would go along with this and other interfaith initiatives, academic or activists in the context of the US. And that is whose narrative of Sarah is being of Sarah and Hagar is being centered. And the pronunciation of the name Hagar pretty much let you know that it was Judeo-Christian. And I continued to write, present, and engage, and in some ways applauding the initiative, but in other ways critically engaging the consequences of continually centering Judeo-Christian locations when we are dealing with the issue of true interreligious or cross-religious discourse. So that meant that when I would talk about Hajar, I would be explicit with regard to the pronunciation and to the implications of the use of Hagar in the ways in which it marginalized Islam and Muslims. And I continued and I saved that perspective, allowing me, for example, to center on the ongoing conflict in Palestine and the severe marginalization and persecution of Palestinian people, causing a large percentage of them to be refugees, to lose their actual state status, and all kinds of civil and human rights. So I couldn't just continue with the conversation, no matter how beneficent was its intention, when any participation in that conversation itself was problematic. So I made those engagements and continued to participate. There was an event at Georgetown University that was about sacred texts from these three traditions and a critical gender reading. So that also gave me fodder in my consideration of the Hajar story. And this topic became actually one of my go-to topics for presentations for quite a number of years, maybe 6 or 7. And in each case, I was tackling what I still consider to be active, and that is the necessity of intersectional analysis and engagement, while at the same time pointing out the impossibility of being thoroughly intersectional, because it would always end up marginalizing somehow whatever one of the multiple aspects that had to be intersected. And in particular, as a Black woman Muslim, there would be something. It would be like gender, binary dynamics that would exclude, obviously, non-binary, but also that would give preferences to male persons, race that was dominated by the ongoing and vicious white supremacy in the context of the United States, and then religion, because even while Islam was invited to these conversations, we were always the invitees, because the funding and the support and the presumption of Judaism and Christianity continued to prevail. So the more time that I had to sort of tinkle with this story, the story of Hajar, the more I realized that while it was both an entry point into some complex discourses, it was only an entry point. And if we wanted to truly engage in those conversations, we would need to roll back and look in detail at what exactly was in the forefront. And that led me to a number of university presentations on this topic, one which was in 1998 at Columbia University in New York. I mentioned this one in particular, although I did do several. I went to several different universities over the course of the years between 93, when I first started working on it, and a publication of my second book, Inside the Gender Jihad, in which I have a chapter engaging with a new Hajar paradigm, because I had to reflect on that story not only within the context of these cross-religious discourses, publications, and intellectual or academic presentations. I had to reflect on that, but also, as I said, I had to reflect on the more intimate spiritual and psychological implications of her story. So let's talk a little bit about that here. We have very scant references to Hajar in the Quran. I mention this because that's the area of specification for me as a religious academic. I'm interested in the Quran, in Quranic analysis, and also in the critical reading of the Quran from the perspective of these intersections. So most of the story that we recognize in Islam is sort of like a historical construction. In other words, lacking a specific record made during the time of Abraham, Sarah, and Hajar. We are going on the stories that were constructed throughout history. And also these stories engage in a certain level of critical, sort of religious consideration because, as I say in my work, the sons and daughters through Sarah and Ishaq or Isaac, and the sons and daughters through Ismael, therefore Hajar, have experienced a different and very critically important history. And when you say history, you know, as they say, it's his story. And the writers of our understanding of the life of Hajar and Sarah, but I'm just going to stick with Hajar now because I didn't continue to engage with Sarah very much. But the writers were all male. And so that means that the viewpoint of the story was taken from a reality that was not equally experienced by women and men as the actual history was going on. So it's important, and there's lots of work like, you know, Women's Memory Forum in Egypt. There's lots of work that goes into how do we retrieve more intimate details about women's lives and participation across these male-dominated telling of the stories. That was part of the intention of the event in New York. But as I said, because it was still dominated by Jewish and Christian women's experiences, it was never going to be complete. We have to constantly add the parts of the story that had been eclipsed by other parts of the story. So I looked at what was available to tell the story of Sarah, tell the story of Hajar, and then I began to fill in as many gaps as I could imagine would benefit the telling of the story from the way in which I was experiencing it and its transformative impact on me. So that story, and again, remember the reading of it, the writing of it and the reading of it was through the perspective of the males in the story and the males who were telling the story. So we know that Sarah was unable to reproduce, and yet at the same time, she was similarly a victim of a patriarchal system that considered legacy and inheritance, as well as being an heir, exclusively in masculine terms. One of the things that I pointed out is that although that patriarchal legacy continued to prevail even in Judaism, one very powerful political shift occurred, and that is in Judaism, you inherit your Judaism from the mother. So that meant that in this configuration, Abraham, Sarah, and Hajar, once Sarah was able to produce, then her male child becomes the central figure in the construction of authenticity, of legacy, you know, and of being the true heir. And that's still how Judaism goes today, that, you know, this priority is given to the female parent, but the patriarchal system was still active. And then on the side of Abraham and Hajar, it never got disentangled. In fact, it focused so much on Abraham and then his first son, Ismael, that it tended to eclipse and erase Sarah. Say it again, to eclipse and erase Hajar. And yet, strategically, in my mind, the existence of Hajar contained certain social, psychological, and spiritual threads that I found helped to create, a beautiful and intriguing tapestry. So Sarah was unable to reproduce, and at the time that she and her husband, Ibrahim, peace be upon him, were in existence, the idea of an heir to the patriarch stemmed exclusively from, let's just put it this way, his sperm. It did not matter if that was through the first partner or through any subsequent partners. And the next challenge in telling these stories was, what is marriage, and how is it constituted, how is it constructed, what is the meaning of it? There were certain ceremonial or ritual or liturgical status transformative procedures like weddings or contracts. And there were also sometimes very little consideration of those with the same power of legitimacy. So the story tells us that it was Sarah who recommended that Ibrahim take a concubine/wife. I don't even want to engage too long in what that might mean, but let's just say we're going to accept that because it doesn't matter to the places where I'm going to go, but still think about that, choosing who would be that female in that relationship was really important to unpack. Given their location on the globe, the assumption is that the choice would come from amongst enslaved people who were not exclusively of African origin, because there were enslaved people from other places in the Islamic world, but they were still predominantly from African/Black people. And let's just say you want to, you're Kimye, Kanye and Kim Kardashian, and Kim experienced certain kind of like medical challenges in her reproduction of the first two kids, which were, carried in her body, but the next two kids was not carried in her body. They paid a surrogate. And so let's just say you want to have a surrogate. You are not going to pick just any body, and let's just keep body separate from any, okay? You're not going to choose a body that you do not expect to be fertile, but also not having the reproductive technology that we have today. The guarantee, you take his sperm and, her egg, and, you put them in a petri dish and you do this, IBT, you do this fertilization thing, and then you have the implant of that into the body, and you still have a child that is a biological reproduction from the Kimye couple, but it's in somebody else's body. We're still doing that, people. I mean, let's be honest. We're just doing it in a very, highly medical advanced kind of way. But at that time, it had to be the actual physical body, and there had to be the actual physical act of sexual intercourse. So you wouldn't choose a body that you did not expect to have positive results. You wouldn't choose an old body, and old was very relative, so I'm not even going to go into it, but you know what I mean. given that a woman is fertile only to a certain point in her life, and then, her fertility just disappears. So you wouldn't choose an old body. If you're pulling from, all the possible slaves and the female slaves, even the female slaves who particularly were groomed for the purpose of sexual pleasure. Let's be honest about this. So the one who might be really sophisticated and have, all of her, ins and outs about it so that she can function as a sex worker, she would not be the first choice. And the reason is because even then they understood the vitality of fertility as a function of youth. They also, as we're talking about age, had no qualms with sexual intercourse with adolescent girls. In fact, as soon as menstruation begins, which as we know could be 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, as soon as it begins, the presumption of the maximum fertility goes with those those 5 ages, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I presume that Hajar was probably a child bride. Now, in modern terminology, due to our understanding of the rights of the child, an adolescent is still a child, irrespective of the fact that the reproductive potential of the female child starts while she's still a child. And because we give an age limit to when sexual intercourse should begin, those ages now are considered to be non-consensual. You cannot give your consent unless you've reached what in Islam we call sinnatul rushd, the age of reasoning, and at the same time the age of reasoning has risen as our understanding and reasoning has advanced. And we realize that a child cannot have the cognizance of the consequences of everything. So we protect them, and as such, today's terms, we advocate restricting marriage until the ages of 18 or 19, minimum. And in fact, since there cannot be the cognizance to give full consent, that category in US legal terms, below that is considered statutory, and any intercourse that occurs is considered to be rape. I know, sounds difficult, let me throw that out there, but you have to think about the body, the female body, its potential, and at the same time, its historical and current abuse or abuses of it. And so, eeny, meeny, miny, moe, we're picking between, potential surrogates for, our husband. We're going to go with what we understand to be the best option. And that option would be a young, potentially under 18-year-old female. There is also, and this is not the cultural attachment to virginity for female bodies that exist so much across the Islamic worlds, past and present. I'm not going to talk about virginity in the way in which that is also problematic. I'm simply going to talk about it in the eeny, meeny, miny, moe. If you're going to make a choice, choosing a virgin is in your favor because they didn't have all the details about exactly, they knew it had something to do with sexual intercourse, but it didn't have all the details. So there would be no way for them to know if it was a woman, slave, groomed for sexual intercourse or sex work, as we call it today, and she had already been having that thing for which she was groomed, and that is sexual intercourse, well, she might also already be pregnant. I mean, you know, it takes like 6 weeks before you realize, oh, I did not get my regular menstrual period 2 weeks ago. And, you know, you're pregnant. I mean, you know, you can take a test today in your own private bathroom, but at that time, they needed other things before they could affirm that there was pregnancy. So they're not going to eeny, meeny, miny, mo and take a groomed sex worker from amongst the lot, because they want to make sure that anything that's going to happen as a consequence of the sexual intercourse between our father Abraham and you know, this child is going to be his child. So a virgin and a child. Think about it. Sure, there are people whose experiences in life do not lead them to assume all the choices that might be available to other people. So if you are an enslaved person, you may dream of and aspire to freedom, but you cannot identify as free. And sometimes, given the history of this institution of slavery, sometimes it is an entire lifetime, and that's all that you experience. So if you're pulling from the pool of enslaved people, particularly a fertile female virginal body, your ability to understand what it is that you're being selected for is going to be limited by the circumstances of your birth. So there's no way that her personal, individual, fully human consent was a factor. She couldn't disagree or negate or refuse because she was a slave. But that doesn't mean that she could consent either. She just kind of like, at best, went along with what was happening, because that's what was happening, and that's what all of her, you know, sort of extended family and other slaves would give her to believe. And they, you know, basically they say this is a good thing because, you know, Abraham is, you know, prominent and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, whatever happens, you should be taken care of. This is a good thing. You should be taken care of. So once we get past the absolute erasure and invisibility of the factors that I just outlined with regard to who would be the best choice, we then have the actual completion of that contractual or non-contractual or tacitly approved, therefore affirmed, and therefore legitimate relationship. And we do have the consequence of a pregnancy, and we do have a successful delivery, giving us our father Ismael, alayhi salam. So the stage is set for a major twist in the plot. And that major twist in the plot is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still had something up the sleeve, because Sarah is then given fertility treatment, to use a modern day scientific term to discuss the miracle of Sarah's fertility as we understand it from the Quran and also from Jewish and Christian discussions of the matter. And not only does she get pregnant, but she successfully has a child. And that child too is male. And that's where we're going to start next time. Thank you. Please understand that this story evolves in several sections. This is the second one. I'm still going to do more. And so if you're interested, please look at the other ones. They'll all be posted together eventually in public forum, but right now it's exclusive to my Patreon page. And thank you, patrons, for your support. See you next time.